There was a measles outbreak in the mid-1800s, and for every single year, from about 1850 until 2005, over 7 million children died every single year on account of measles. That's how long it was. But we no longer talk about measles in our time. Why not? Because we found the vaccine. Once you recognize the virus, you can find the vaccine and you can eradicate it. I kept asking myself one question as I prepared for the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. What does it mean for us in our time? Because every single apparition that Mary has come to us in the past 150 years, in some way she has alluded to the Immaculate Conception. And it became a dogma of the faith only about 150 years ago. So why such an emphasis in our time on the Immaculate Conception? I finally came to the answer when I read the words of Pope Pius XII in 1946. He said, regarding our times, "Perhaps the greatest sin in the world today is that men have begun to lose the sense of sin." In other words, the greatest threat to our spiritual health in our times is that oftentimes we don't even realize that we're infected. And if you don't know that you have a virus, how are you ever going to seek a vaccine to save you? What does the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary mean for us here today? It means a vaccine to save us from the epidemic of the loss of a sense of sin in our times that is claiming so many souls. See, we're all born with original sin, which means that we have a clouded intellect. The more we sin, the more clouded our intellect becomes, and we cannot decipher between good and bad. It means that we have a fallen flesh that is always tempted, and it means that we live and inhabit a world that is in rebellion against God. Well, the problem we face is that this is all we know. It's like being born with an illness. It's just life. It is what it is, and that's it. And the greatest temptation that we all face in life is to surrender to the struggle. To surrender of the struggle of the flesh, of the world, and the temptations of the devil. To surrender to the way that things are and forget about the way that things should be. I think about this especially when I consider Mass attendance. I can't tell you how happy I was to see so many people come out here today for the Solemnity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I mean, it's beautiful. But in the 1920s, the bishops met in America because there's 20% of Catholics not going to Mass on Sundays. And they said, this is a big problem. What are we going to do to fix it? We need to get this 20% back. 100 years later, how many Catholics attend Mass on Sundays? 30%. That's a loss of the sense of sin in our times. When we no longer realize the gravity of where we've come. And that is why Mary's Immaculate Conception is so important for us today. Mary, from the moment that she was conceived in the womb, was untouched by sin. So what does that mean? It means that nobody in this world besides Christ himself had a greater sense of sin, of good and evil, of right and wrong, than the Blessed Virgin Mary. She never lost her sensitivity to what was right in the world. She was totally undefiled by sin. So if in fact the Pope was right that the greatest sin in the world today is that men have begun to lose the sense of sin, then Mary is the greatest vaccine we could ever turn to. For no one in this world understood the sense of sin more than she who was conceived without it, who never consented to it or allowed it into her own flesh. And this is the great secret of devotion to the Immaculate Virgin Mary. The closer that we draw to her, the more pure we become. The more we ourselves receive back a sense of sin, a sense of right and wrong, of truth and error, of good and evil in the world, in our lives, and in our church. The closer we draw to Mary, the more she purifies our eyes so that we can see things as they really are, rather than accept them just because it is the way it is. And I believe that is exactly the reason why the Immaculate Conception and devotion to the Immaculate Heart has become so important over the last 150 years, exactly in this time when there's been such a loss of the sense of God, of the conscience, and the sense of sin. All of a sudden, devotion to the Immaculate Heart of the Virgin Mary skyrockets. In 1830, Mary appeared to St. Catherine Labouré in France, and she said to her, "God wishes to charge you with a mission. Times are evil in France and all over the world." Therefore, she offered her the miraculous medal. And she asked that all people wear this around their neck. And she said, and right underneath that medal is the words, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." And in Lourdes, just 25 years after this, just 4 years after the dogma of the Immaculate Conception was proclaimed by the see, she appeared to Saint Bernadette, asking her to pray, to ask the world to come back to penance and conversion, to return to her son. And when Bernadette asked who she was, what was her response? "I am the Immaculate Conception." And lastly, in Fatima, in 1917, Mary appeared to these 3 children, and what was the essence of the gift that she came to give them? Devotion to her Immaculate Heart. She said to them, "Jesus wishes to establish throughout the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart. I promise salvation to those who embrace it, and their souls will be loved by God as flowers placed by me before his throne." In the past 150 years, why so much emphasis from the Church and from God himself sending the Blessed Virgin Mary to instill a deeper devotion to her Immaculate Conception in our times? Because this is the vaccine that can save us from the virus of our times, the loss of the sense of sin. Because the more closer we draw to Mary, the more our conscience will be enlightened, the more pure we will become, and the more strengthened we will become to never surrender to the darkness within and around us. She'll keep us immaculate with her. Mary's Immaculate Heart keeps us at enmity with the evil one and his offspring. That's what today's gospel is all about. God said, I will place enmity between you and your offspring and the offspring of the snake. Right in our time, that enmity has been lost. We have become so one with the world, one with the culture, that you can't distinguish between the two. But when we draw closer to the Blessed Virgin Mary, she sets us at enmity with everything that is evil. And we learn to stand our ground apart from what separates us from God. So what does the Immaculate Conception mean for us today? Today in a world, in a country, and even at times in a church that has lost its sense of sin. It means locating the vaccine that can save our souls. It means an illumination of conscience, knowing right from wrong, truth from error, that which leads to life versus that which leads to death. And finally, perhaps most of all, it means knowing the difference between bread and body, between wine and blood. It means looking at what takes place on this altar and recognizing with your whole being that Jesus Christ, the Son of God and the Son of Mary, has come into your presence. And I promise you one thing, if you always recognize that, if you always sense his presence with you here, you will never lose the sense of sin in your own life. Mary, conceived without original sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee.